The year was around 1200 AD, a time when the Islamic world was still a vibrant center of scholarship and discovery. From the bustling streets of Baghdad, a young man named Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi set out on a journey that would carry him across lands rich with memory, legend, and ruin. He was no ordinary traveler. Born into a family of learning, al-Baghdadi had trained in medicine, law, and philosophy, disciplines that in his day were not isolated silos, but threads woven together into the fabric of wisdom. His mind had been sharpened by the works of Aristotle and the echoing voices of ancient Greek thinkers, translated and preserved through the vast libraries of the Islamic Golden Age. Yet, what stirred him most was not the quiet comfort of books, but the allure of the world itself, the desire to see with his own eyes what others only described in ink. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, Baghdad was a city of contrasts. Its scholars debated lofty questions of metaphysics, while merchants bargained for silks, spices, and glass brought from the far corners of the known world. But the world beyond Baghdad was in turmoil. Crusaders still clashed with Muslim dynasties for control of the Levant, while distant Mongol riders cast a shadow on the eastern horizon. To embark on a journey in such a time was not simply an act of curiosity, it was an act of courage, perhaps even defiance. Baghdadi's steps first carried him northward to Mosul, a city alive with commerce along the Tigris River, where caravans arrived heavy with goods from Persia and Anatolia. From there, he made his way toward Jerusalem, sacred to three faiths and, in his lifetime, still echoing with the tensions of holy war. He walked streets where monks, soldiers, pilgrims, and scholars rubbed shoulders uneasily, where the stones themselves seemed to breathe history. Damascus and Aleppo followed, both cities renowned for their bazaars, their great mosques, and their schools of learning. Each place left a mark on his notebooks and on his memory. But al-Baghdadi was not content with mere cities. His heart was set on a destination that loomed larger than any fortress, older than any empire, a land whose monuments whispered of a civilization long vanished yet never forgotten. Around the year 1200, his road bent westward. He crossed the burning wastes of the Sinai, his caravan moving slowly across seas of sand. For days the horizon yielded nothing but the glare of sun on stone, the mirage of water that never came. At night, the desert sky opened in a vast dome of stars, the same constellations the ancient Egyptians once aligned their temples to. At last, after weeks of hardship, he reached the green ribbon of the Nile, a sight so astonishing it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Here, where life clung to the banks of the river, ancient history still stood, not only in books but in stone. Al-Baghdadi would record what he saw in a remarkable volume, a mixture of travelogue and meditation, entitled The Book of Edification and Admonition. It was more than a simple guide, it was a dialogue between the past and the present, between a civilization that had vanished beneath the sands and one that still tried to grasp its meaning. Egypt awaited him, a land of wonders, ruins, and enigmas. And it would leave him with impressions so powerful that even centuries later, readers could feel the awe of a scholar standing at the threshold of history. When Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi first set eyes on Egypt, he was overwhelmed. Before him stretched a land unlike any he had ever known, where life itself clung to the banks of one great river. He described Egypt as a valley hemmed in by two mountain ranges, one to the east, one to the west, a natural corridor that funneled all existence toward the Nile. And through this artery of life, the river wound its way northward until it fanned into a great delta and poured into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile astonished him most of all. Its length seemed endless, a serpent of water that defied the imagination. We know of no other river in the inhabited world that covers a greater distance, he marvelled. And he was right at nearly 6,800 kilometres, The Nile was not just a river but a lifeline, sustaining human life in one of the most arid regions on Earth. Without its floods, Egypt would have been nothing but desert, a sea of sand unbroken by green. With it, the land blossomed. To al-Baghdadi, this geography carried an almost spiritual quality. The river's rhythm dictated the rhythm of life. It rose and fell with the seasons, carving into the earth a story older than kings, older even than the pyramids themselves. It was here, along these banks, that one of the world's first great civilizations had emerged, and even in ruin its legacy was staggering. As his caravan moved along the water, he began to see the remnants of a world that seemed too vast, too intricate to belong to mortals. Scattered across the floodplain were temples of stone, their columns rising like petrified forests. Tombs lay crumbling beside the waters, silent reminders of dynasties long past. Broken statues jutted from the sand as if reaching out to remind the living of forgotten names. Al-Baghdadi was no stranger to ruins. He had passed through Crusader fortresses and seen the remains of Byzantine walls, but nothing compared to this. Egypt's relics seemed older than time itself, as if the earth had been carved by some divine hand. He wrote with a mixture of awe and disbelief, for no words could fully contain the sight of monuments so immense, so enduring, that they appeared to mock the centuries. Yet even among this abundance of wonders, one vision drew him irresistibly: the pyramids. Rising above the horizon, near the ancient city of Memphis, they were not ruins, hidden in shadow, but giants, still standing proudly against the sky. To al-Baghdadi, they were not simply tombs, nor even mere feats of engineering. They were the very essence of mystery. Egypt was a land of strange stories and impossible monuments, and al-Baghdadi had just stepped into its heart. As al-Baghdadi journeyed further along the Nile, he recorded what his eyes beheld: the broken skeletons of temples, the weathered outlines of tombs, fragments of once mighty walls, all scattered like bones on the desert's edge. Some leaned precariously, half devoured by the sand. Others still stood proud, their columns etched with carvings that no one alive could fully understand. To him, they were not relics of a single dynasty, but the accumulated memory of millennia, a civilization that had been building and rebuilding upon the same strip of fertile land for thousands of years. He noted how the Nile's waters lapped against the edges of ruins, as though the river itself refused to abandon them. At times, entire temple complexes appeared to grow straight from the riverbank, half consumed by reeds, half reflecting in the water. Travelers in his time often spoke of the uncanny feeling Egypt inspired, a place where the past was never buried, but lingered sometimes in shadow, sometimes in plain sight. Yet for all the splendor, al-Baghdadi sensed a kind of decay. These temples were not bustling with worshippers. Their gods had fallen silent. Many of the tombs were broken open, their treasures looted, their chambers disturbed. He recorded how local villagers treated the ruins with a mix of awe and pragmatism. Some used the finely cut stones as quarries, dismantling the past to build their present. Others wandered among the remains, whispering old stories or spinning new legends about what lay hidden beneath the sands. But none of these sights, for all their wonder, could compare to what lay ahead. As his caravan turned toward the plateau near Memphis, the landscape itself seemed to shift. Rising on the horizon were forms so immense, so sharply geometric, that they seemed less like the work of human hands and more like mountains forged by gods. Here stood the pyramids of Giza. To travelers of the medieval world, they were already the most fabled monuments of Egypt, their fame carried across continents by rumor, poetry, and trade. Al-Baghdadi himself confessed that he had heard much about them before arriving, but no description, however vivid, could match the sight of their reality. The pyramids did not simply dominate the skyline, they redefined it. Spread across the desert like eternal sentinels, they dwarfed everything around them. Al-Baghdadi wrote with uncharacteristic awe, The ancient monuments in Egypt are such as I have never seen nor heard tell of in other lands. First among them are the pyramids. For him, the journey through ruins was no longer about what had been lost. It was now about confronting what had survived, towering and immovable, even as centuries and empires had crumbled away. The pyramids rose before him in a line along the desert's edge, a procession of giants keeping watch over the Nile. Al-Baghdadi counted them. They are very numerous, he wrote, and noted how they stretched along the Giza plateau toward Memphis, scattered across the sands like a constellation of stone. Some were small and humble, built of clay or mud brick, the work of forgotten kings. Others were immense, built from blocks of limestone so precisely cut they seemed to lock into one another, as though shaped by some hidden geometry. He described their variety. Some constructed in steps, like giant stairways to the heavens, others with smooth, tapering sides that gleamed beneath the desert sun. To his eyes, it was not a single monument, but a whole kingdom of pyramids, each telling a fragment of a greater story. Yet, among them all, three stood apart, three colossal forms that dominated every horizon, drawing the gaze of every traveller like lodestars. These three, he noted, are the pyramids that everyone talks about, points at, and characterizes in terms of their sheer size. Two in particular seemed almost beyond comprehension. Poets, he wrote, had become infatuated with them, as if language itself strained to capture their majesty. For al-Baghdadi, the attempt to look upon them was exhausting. His eyes faltered, unable to take in the whole. They were too vast, too unyielding, as if the mind could not fully grasp what the body beheld. Standing before them, one could not help but feel diminished. What kind of people had raised these mountains of stone? What kind of will had commanded so many hands, so much labour, across so many years? In an age where even mighty castles took decades to complete, the pyramids seemed to mock the ambitions of lesser rulers. They had been ancient when Rome was still young, immovable when empires that followed had turned to dust. Travellers in al-Baghdadi's time often debated their purpose. Were they tombs, fortresses, or astronomical markers? Some even whispered that they had been built before the flood, relics of a world swept away. Al-Baghdadi did not claim to know, but he was certain of one thing: no other monuments on earth could match them. In that moment, the pyramids were not relics of a dead civilization. They were alive with presence, with a kind of silent authority that stretched across centuries. They had become symbols not only of Egypt's past, but of the very endurance of human ambition. And as al-Baghdadi gazed up at their sunlit faces, he knew he was standing at the threshold of mysteries too great to be solved in a single lifetime. For al-Baghdadi, the pyramids were not silent relics, they were alive with human activity. Around their vast bases, people came and went, drawn by curiosity, necessity, or reverence. He wrote of locals who dared to climb the sheer faces of the stones, inching upward, step by step, until they reached the very summits. From there, they looked out over the desert and the Nile, the whole land of Egypt stretched beneath their feet. These daring climbers, he noted, risked their lives for the glory of touching the heavens, where kings once dreamed of eternity. Others saw the pyramids less as marvels than as resources. Stonecutters came with chisels and hammers, prying loose the finely cut blocks that had stood for millennia. To them, the pyramids were quarries of ready-made stone, perfect for mosques, houses, and bridges. Each block carried away was a theft from the past, yet also a continuation of it, as the pyramids themselves were absorbed into the fabric of living Egypt. But the most fascinating to al-Baghdadi were those who obsessed over the hidden passages. The pyramids, he learned, were riddled with narrow corridors and dark shafts that lured men inside like labyrinths of mystery. He described one of the great pyramids that had an opening, an invitation into its depths. Those who entered found themselves wandering through winding halls, vertical wells, and chambers that seemed to multiply endlessly. Many returned to tell stories of sudden drops, of traps carved into the stone, of dead ends that mocked their determination. Always they reached a point beyond which they could not go. And then there were the tales, half rumour, half warning, that grew around these ventures. Some said the pyramids housed colonies of bats so large they rivaled pigeons in size, swarming in the dark and startling intruders with their shrieks. Others spoke of inscriptions covering the walls, written in ancient scripts that no living soul could read. Al-Baghdadi himself admitted he had never found a single Egyptian who claimed to know their meaning. To the people of his time, the hieroglyphs were silent voices, guardians of secrets locked beyond reach. These stories fascinated him not because they solved the riddle of the pyramids, but because they showed how deeply the living still wrestled with the dead. Each climber, each stonecutter, each explorer was part of an unbroken chain of wonder stretching back to antiquity. The pyramids were not inert, they provoked obsession, fear, ambition, and reverence. To stand among them was to feel both the weight of history and the restless energy of the present. For al-Baghdadi, the pyramids were not monuments frozen in time. They were conversations between ages, where every visitor, from the humblest peasant to the most curious scholar, left behind a trace of their own story. Not far from the three great pyramids, al-Baghdadi encountered another marvel, one so strange and haunting that it seemed almost alive. Rising from the sands, half-buried and weather-worn, was the colossal head and neck of a stone creature the locals called Abu al-Hol, Father of Terror, or as he translated it, Old Father Dread. What struck him most was its expression. The massive head bore the likeness of a human face, but carved on a scale beyond comprehension. Though the body lay hidden beneath centuries of drifting sand, the features of the face were clear. Its brow was broad, its eyes stern, yet there was an elegance about it, a faint trace of a smile that softened its severity. To al-Baghdadi, it was as though the sculptors of some forgotten age had captured not only a likeness, but an emotion dignity mixed with mystery. The people who lived nearby spoke of it in whispers, as if it carried a power that was not to be spoken of lightly. They believed its body stretched beneath the desert, vast and hidden, as if the sands themselves conspired to keep its full form concealed. To them, it was not merely a statue, but a guardian, an ancient sentinel left to watch over the pyramids and the dead kings who slept within them. In al-Baghdadi's time, no one knew who had carved it or why. Myths swirled like desert winds. Some claimed it was the work of demons, others that it was older even than the pyramids themselves, built in an age before memory. For a scholar like al-Baghdadi, trained in the rational philosophies of Aristotle, these stories were fanciful. And yet, as he gazed upon that half-smiling face, he could not help but feel what generations before him had felt, awe tinged with unease. The Sphinx, half buried in sand, embodied the paradox of Egypt itself. It was both ruin and miracle, both silent and eloquent. Its face had watched over centuries of rise and fall, empires born and broken, armies marching and vanishing, and yet it endured, timeless and inscrutable, a riddle carved in stone. To al-Baghdadi, the pyramids had shown the scale of human ambition, but the Sphinx whispered something else, an enigma that could not be measured in height or size. It hinted at mysteries deeper than stone, mysteries of belief, of power, and of time itself. For all the legends, what impressed al-Baghdadi most was not the myths that clung to the pyramids and the Sphinx, but the sheer mastery of their construction. Standing before these vast monuments, he considered the enormity of the task. Millions of stone blocks, each hewn with precision, transported across miles of desert, and stacked in a harmony so exact that the structures had endured not for centuries, but for millennia. He wrote of their design with reverence, calling it remarkable in respect both to design and to precision of execution. To him, The pyramids had not merely survived time, they had forced time itself to endure them. Dynasties had risen and fallen, empires had passed into dust, but these stones remained, as if immune to decay. Al-Baghdadi imagined the minds behind them, noble intellects, pure and devoted, pouring every effort into shaping something that would outlast their own lives. To him, the pyramids spoke of their builders more eloquently than any written record could. They were voices in stone, testifying to a people whose ambition reached toward eternity. What tools had they used? What knowledge had guided them? Even in the 13th century, these questions remained unanswered, their solutions lost to time. Some claimed sorcery, others divine aid. But al-Baghdadi saw in them something greater, the triumph of human ingenuity. He was convinced that the pyramids were born not of magic, but of discipline, intellect, and the willingness to endure unimaginable toil. And there was something almost unsettling in their permanence. If a monument could survive for nearly 4,000 years, what did that say about the fragility of kingdoms, of cultures, even of memory itself? Perhaps that was the true message of the pyramids, that all human lives, even those of kings, are fleeting, but the works of collective genius can echo across the ages. In this way, the pyramids were not simply tombs, they were lessons in ambition, in endurance, and in the power of human will. To al-Baghdadi, they stood as exemplars of what he called the pinnacle of the possible. By the year 1200, when Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi stood before the Great Pyramid, it had already reigned as the tallest man-made structure on earth for nearly 3,700 years. No cathedral spire, no fortress tower, no minaret of his own age could rival it. To realize this was staggering. All the centuries between his time and the birth of Christ had passed, and still the pyramid had already been ancient. He saw in it the grandeur of a civilization that had risen, flourished, and vanished, leaving behind only monuments too vast to be erased. Empires that once claimed dominion over Egypt, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs had each left their mark. Yet through it all, the Great Pyramid had endured, unmoved, its peak piercing the horizon like a reminder of eternity. To al-Baghdadi, this endurance was not merely physical, it was symbolic. The pyramid was more than a tomb, it was a declaration of permanence, a message carved in stone that time itself could not silence. Standing before it, he must have felt the gulf between his world and the world of its builders. They were gone, their language unreadable, their gods forgotten, and yet their vision had not only survived, but towered over the living. He recorded his admiration with solemn respect, noting that the pyramids all but speak aloud of their builders, telling us what sort of folk they were, giving voice to their intellects, relating the stories of their lives and times. They were monuments not of stone alone, but of human ambition. They were the voices of a civilization that refused to be buried. This was Egypt as he experienced it, a land where the past was never fully gone, where ancient kings still seemed to command the desert. And as he left Giza, al-Baghdadi's words became less those of a traveller and more those of a philosopher. He was not merely describing what he saw, he was meditating on what it meant. Because in the end, the pyramids were not just Egyptian, they belonged to humanity. They were reminders that greatness could endure, that human beings, fragile, fleeting, could nonetheless leave behind something immortal. And with this, al-Baghdadi's account opens the door to a larger story, not only of pyramids and monuments, but of the entire civilization that built them, that lived and thrived along the waters of the Nile for more than 3,000 years. At this point, the narrative opens wider. No longer confined to the eyes of a single traveller, it expands to embrace the whole arc of Egyptian civilization. The voice of the storyteller shifts. My name is Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. So begins a new chapter, one that places Egypt not just in the context of al-Baghdadi's age, but in the span of all human history. The task now is to trace how this civilization, born from the waters of the Nile, could rise so high, endure so long, and eventually fade into silence. Egypt's story is one of the longest and greatest epics ever told. Where many empires counted themselves fortunate to last through 30 reigns, Egypt endured 31 dynasties of kings, a line stretching across more than 3 millennia. Each king left behind monuments, records, and mysteries, and together they formed a tapestry of power unmatched in scale and duration. Historians have long struggled to make sense of this abundance. To tame Egypt's vast chronology, they divided its history into 3 great kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Between them lay intermediate periods, times when central power collapsed, dynasties fell, and Egypt fragmented into rival states. Yet, like the Nile itself, Egypt always returned to unity, swelling and receding, expanding and contracting, never ceasing entirely. What made this possible was not chance, it was the river. The Nile was not only Egypt's lifeline, it was its identity. Without it, the land was desert. With it, the land was paradise. It determined where people lived, how they farmed, and even how they thought of time. The Nile was the great constant, the pulse of the Egyptian world. And to understand Egypt, one must first understand the river that gave it life. The Nile. It was the thread that stitched Egypt's world together. Without it, there would have been no civilization, no temples, no pyramids. It was not just a river, but a god, a mystery, and a promise of life in a land otherwise ruled by death. The river's journey began far away, in the highlands of East Africa. Its longest branch, the White Nile, flowed from Lake Victoria, an inland sea so vast it rivaled entire countries in size. The other, the Blue Nile, thundered down from the mountains of Ethiopia, carrying with it rich silt and minerals. At Khartoum, in what is now Sudan, the 2 streams met, their waters merging into a single force that cut across deserts, flowing north for another 2,000 kilometers before reaching Egypt. By the time the Nile spread into its wide delta at Cairo, it had traveled some 6,800 kilometers, nearly 1/6 of the Earth's circumference. It was either the longest or the second longest river in the world, rivaled only by the Amazon. Its basin drained 1/10 of Africa's entire landmass. Numbers alone could not capture its importance. What mattered was that, in Egypt's parched climate, it was the only thing that made life possible. Unlike Mesopotamia, where rainfall and rivers were unpredictable and destructive, the Nile was steady, dependable. Each summer, rains in distant Ethiopia swelled its waters, and the flood rolled down into Egypt, arriving in mid-August with astonishing regularity. To the Egyptians, this was not simply nature, it was divinity. The river rose, the fields turned black with fertile mud, and crops could be planted. Then, as the waters receded, the land bloomed with wheat, barley, beans, and flax. It is no exaggeration to say that every blade of grass, every tree, every animal, and every human life in Egypt owed its existence to the Nile. Egypt, the ancient historian Herodotus would later write, is the gift of the Nile. To al-Baghdadi, observing the river centuries later, this was obvious. He knew that without the Nile, there would be only sand and silence. But with it, Egypt had once been a paradise, and for thousands of years, the heart of one of the world's greatest civilizations.
Long before pyramids pierced the sky or pharaohs ruled from gilded thrones, the Nile Valley had already been a stage for human life. Archaeological discoveries reveal that traces of humanity in this region stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. Stone tools, shaped by archaic hands, have been found in river deposits dating to some 600,000 years ago, silent witnesses to a time when early humans stalked the floodplains. By around 100,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens had followed the corridor of the Nile out of East Africa, using it as a highway to new worlds. From here, humans spread into the Levant, Asia, and Europe. In this sense, Egypt was not just the cradle of a civilization. It was one of the gateways through which humanity itself expanded. But Egypt's fate was also bound to a far older cycle: the shifting moods of the Sahara. For millions of years, the desert was not always desert. Climate change, driven by the tilt of the earth and the pulse of the monsoon, transformed it again and again. More than 200 times, the Sahara turned green, blossoming into a savanna of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Herds of gazelle and antelope roamed there, and humans followed, leaving behind rock paintings of hunters and animals across cliffs that are today scorched and barren. When the rains failed, the green vanished. The grasslands withered, lakes evaporated, people fled. Again and again, they returned to the Nile, the one constant refuge. It was this rhythm of desert and river that gradually concentrated life along the valley. Around 13,000 BC, during one of the Sahara's driest phases, a culture known as the Sabellian began experimenting with wild grains. They gathered wheat and barley, eventually developing their own domesticated strains. This was a quiet revolution. The gathering of seeds became farming, and the wandering bands of hunters began to settle. By 9000 BC, they wove thread, kept animals, and watched the skies. At Napta Playa, a desert basin far to the south, they erected a circle of stones that aligned with the stars, an ancient calendar, perhaps, to track the seasons of rain and harvest. Built around 7500 BC, it has been called Egypt's Stonehenge, though in truth it predates Britain's monument by thousands of years. Here, long before the pyramids, people were already measuring the heavens, binding their survival to the rhythms of the cosmos. But the Sahara's patience ended. The rains shifted away, the green world shriveled, and the desert returned. Those who had grazed their cattle and farmed in its valleys had no choice but to abandon it. They drifted back to the Nile, to that thin strip of green clinging to the river. And there, compressed together by the desert's advancing wall, the seeds of a great civilization began to take root. As the Sahara hardened into a sea of sand, the Nile Valley became more than a refuge. It became the only world that mattered. People gathered along its banks, first in scattered hamlets, then in villages, and slowly in towns. The river, narrow and fertile, forced them into intimacy. Communities grew closer, trade flourished, rivalries sharpened, and identities began to form. The Egyptians themselves called their homeland Ta Mehu and Ta Shemau, the two lands. To us, they are Lower and Upper Egypt, but their orientation was not ours. For the Egyptians, facing always upstream toward the rising flood, south was up and north was down. Thus, Upper Egypt lay in the long valley of the south, and Lower Egypt in the spreading delta of the north. This division was not only geographic, it was cultural and spiritual. The people of Upper Egypt, closer to Nubia, tended to be darker-skinned and worshipped the vulture goddess Nekbet, guardian of the white crown. They lived in narrow valleys where cliffs rose close to the river, and their traditions bore traces of their southern neighbors. Meanwhile, the people of Lower Egypt, nearer to the Mediterranean, leaned toward the cobra goddess Wadjet, who coiled on the red crown. Their world was a broad delta of branching streams, fertile marshes, and wider horizons. The Egyptians gave poetic names to their world. The fertile floodplain was Kemet, the Black Land, named for the dark silt left by the Nile's waters. This was the realm of Horus, falcon-headed god of kingship and protection. Beyond it stretched Deshret, the red land of the desert, harsh, burning, and deadly, the domain of Set, god of chaos and violence. To live in Egypt was to dwell on the fragile line between the two, forever dependent on the river's mercy. Every year, the Nile's rhythm reminded them of this balance. Without its floods, the Black Land withered. With too much, it drowned. Their entire cosmos revolved around this cycle. Life was not seen as secure, but as precarious, resting on the favor of the river, the gods, and the king, who was meant to hold both in harmony. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, these identities had solidified into rival kingdoms. To the south, a line of rulers wearing the white crown commanded Upper Egypt. To the north, their counterparts wore the red crown of the Delta. Between them lay tension and opportunity. For though they were divided, the Nile tied them together. Trade passed along its waters, and so did ambition. The stage was set for a union that would reshape history, the binding of the two lands into one. Far upriver, where the Nile narrowed and tumbled through rocky gorges, lay Egypt's natural boundary, the cataracts of Aswan. Here, the river broke into white water, roaring over granite boulders and shallow channels. In the ancient tongue, the Greeks called them cataractes, rushing down, and the name was fitting. The waters thundered so loudly that Egyptians believed they burst up from subterranean seas, as if the earth itself was forcing them forth. For Egypt, this was more than a natural wonder. It was a gate. Boats could go no further. Beyond lay Nubia, a land of gold, ivory, and dark-skinned warriors, often an enemy, sometimes an ally. This threshold shaped Egypt's sense of itself. To the north was the heartland, to the south, the dangerous unknown. On an island amid these waters, the Egyptians built a temple at Abu, Elephant, a place that became a hub of the ivory trade. Later, the Greeks would rename it Elephantine. From here, caravans crossed into the deserts of Sudan, bringing back precious metals, incense, ebony, and slaves. To the Egyptians, Elephantine was not only a trading post, but a sacred place, a spot where chaos and order met. It was also the limit of their world. Herodotus, centuries later, would record an Egyptian oracle declaring, "All the land watered by the Nile in its course is Egypt, and all who drink of the river below Elephantine are Egyptians." In this vision, the Nile defined not just geography, but identity. To be Egyptian was to live downstream, bound to the river's flow. This southern border was a line often tested. Armies marched through Aswan's gate, sometimes Egyptian pharaohs pressing into Nubia for conquest, sometimes Nubian kings pushing north in defiance. The frontier was not a wall but a bridge where cultures mingled. Nubian soldiers served in Egyptian armies. Egyptian priests absorbed southern deities. The god of the cataracts, Khnum, was worshipped as the divine potter who shaped mankind from clay upon his wheel. Yet for much of early history, Aswan remained the edge of Egypt's reach. To look beyond its cataracts was to gaze into mystery. And for a people who defined themselves by the order of the Nile, it was enough to let the roaring waters mark the boundary between what was Egypt and what was not. As the Nile wound northward from Aswan, the land broadened, and with it grew the settlements that would one day shape the destiny of Egypt. The cliffs of Nubian sandstone fell away, replaced by greener floodplains fertile enough to sustain larger populations. It was here that some of Egypt's most enduring cities rose, their names echoing across the centuries. In the south stood Waset, which we call Thebes. To the Egyptians, it was more than a city. It was a sacred center, a seat of power where kings were enthroned and gods honored with lavish temples. On the eastern bank of the river, where the sun rose, lived the bustling quarters of the living, markets, homes, workshops. Across the river, on the western bank where the sun set, lay the silent realm of the dead, an entire landscape of tombs, stretching deep into the Valley of the Kings. Thebes would become the capital of Upper Egypt and, in later ages, the beating heart of empire. Further north, the Nile branched westward into an oasis that the Greeks would call the Fayum. This lake and its fertile basin formed a kind of natural garden. To the Egyptians, it was sacred to Sobek, the crocodile god, for the waters teemed with the reptiles. Herodotus tells us that in temples here, crocodiles were kept alive, adorned with golden ornaments, and fed with delicacies. They were not merely feared beasts, but divine creatures, protectors of the land. Yet in other places, they were hunted with cunning and danger, baited with pigs, blinded with mud, their hides turned into javelin shafts. To the Egyptians, the crocodile was both holy and hostile, a paradox made flesh. And then there was Memphis, the great city where Upper and Lower Egypt met. Its Egyptian name, Inebu Hej, meant the White Walls. It was here that Egypt's unity found its balance, at the edge of the delta, where the river began to fan into countless channels. Memphis was both political and symbolic. The seat of kings, the home of Ptah, god of creation and craftsman, and the place from which Egypt could be ruled as one. In later centuries, it would fade before the rising city of Cairo, but in al-Baghdadi's time, its shadow still lingered and its legacy still resonated. Together, these cities, Thebes, Fayum, and Memphis, formed more than mere habitations. They were mirrors of Egypt itself, its religion, its balance of life and death, its ties to the river and the gods. To travel among them was to see how geography and belief intertwined, each shaping the other into the civilization that would astonish the world. Each year, like clockwork, the miracle of the Nile returned. In mid-August, as if answering some divine summons, the waters began to rise. They swelled and spread across the valley, transforming fields into shallow lakes. For 100 days, the flood endured, and then, just as predictably, the waters withdrew, leaving behind a rich black mud that glistened in the sun. In that dark soil lay the promise of life for the coming year. The Egyptians built their entire world around this rhythm. They divided their year into 3 sacred seasons. First came Akhet, the season of inundation, when the river rose and the land was submerged. Next was Pere, the season of emergence, when crops sprouted in the freshly nourished earth. Last came Shemu, the season of harvest, when grain and barley were gathered and stored, sustaining the people until the waters returned again. But the floods were not always gentle. If the river failed to rise, famine stalked the land. If it rose too high, villages drowned and fields were swept away. The Nile was both benevolent and dangerous, a god of abundance and of wrath. One hymn written in the ancient tongue captures this duality. If he is greedy, the whole land suffers. Great and small fall moaning. People are changed at his coming. When he rises, then the land is in joy. Then every belly is glad. Every jaw has held laughter. So vital was the flood that the Egyptians invented ways to measure it. At Aswan and elsewhere, they built nilometers, staircases descending into stone wells where priests marked the water's height in cubits. Each year, people gathered anxiously to hear the measurement announced. Would it be a year of plenty, of hunger, or of ruin? The priests alone, it seemed, could read the river's mind. For the farmers, the Nile's gifts defined their daily lives. In the rich mud, they planted wheat, barley, beans, and flax. They grew papyrus for writing and reeds for mats and boats. Livestock grazed along the floodplain, while fishing and fowling filled the diet with variety. The river provided everything: food, transport, trade, even the calendar itself. To live in Egypt was to live in dependence, not upon the will of kings alone, but upon the rising and falling of the river. And in that dependence, the Egyptians saw not weakness, but holiness. They sang to the Nile as to a god, offering hymns of thanks for its bounty and prayers for its mercy. Thus, year after year, century after century, Egypt's life rose and fell with the waters, as steady as the stars. It was a cycle that bound not only crops and cattle, but also religion, politics, and identity. And in that rhythm, the Egyptians found eternity. For centuries, the Nile Valley was divided, two kingdoms staring at one another across the river's eternal flow. In the south, rulers of Upper Egypt wore the tall white crown, their banners guarded by the vulture goddess Nekhbet. In the north, the kings of the delta bore the red crown, with the cobra goddess Wadjet coiled proudly at its crest. Two lands, two peoples, two destinies. Yet the river tied them together, and sooner or later, one would seek to rule both. Around 3000 BC, a man named Narmer rose to claim that destiny. Known also by his personal name Menes, he took as his royal name Narmer, the fighting catfish. The title was strange, yet apt. The Nile catfish was no ordinary creature. It lurked unseen in the waters, striking with electric bursts that stunned prey into submission. To take its name was to embody patience, stealth, and sudden violence. The most important record of Narmer's reign survives on a carved relic known as the Narmer palette. On one side, he is shown grasping an enemy by the hair, raising a mace to strike. He wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, asserting his dominance over his southern realm. On the other side, the imagery shifts. Narmer now dons the red crown of Lower Egypt, leading his troops as rows of defeated enemies lie beneath his feet. Below, a bull crashes through the walls of a fortress, a symbol of unstoppable conquest. Between these scenes is a curious image, two fantastical beasts with long, intertwining necks. Some scholars see in this a metaphor for unity, the entwining of two lands into one kingdom. Whether allegory or triumphal boast, the message was clear. Narmer had done what no one before him had achieved. He had bound Upper and Lower Egypt together under a single crown. This unification was not merely political, it was cosmic. To the Egyptians, the king was not just a ruler, but the divine bridge between order and chaos, between gods and men. By uniting the two lands, Narmer was not simply a conqueror. He was the guarantor of Ma'at, the principle of harmony and balance that held the universe together. With Egypt united under Narmer, a new age began. Power was no longer fragmented among small chiefs and petty rulers. It was concentrated in the hands of one king. But to hold such vast lands together required more than force. It required symbols, language, and belief. Out of this need, some of the most enduring features of Egyptian civilization were born. The Egyptians soon developed a system of writing unlike anything seen before. Hieroglyphs. The Greeks would later call them sacred carvings, and to see them inscribed on tomb walls or temple columns, one understands why. They were not simply letters, but pictures alive with meaning. Birds, eyes, hands, reeds, and animals, each a symbol that could stand for a sound, a word, or an idea. An image of a man with a hand raised to his mouth meant to eat. A coiled rope could mean a sound, or a place, or an entire concept. Writing was no longer the preserve of memory or speech. It was carved into stone, eternal as the monuments themselves. Unlike Mesopotamia, where writing had evolved gradually from simple marks, Egyptian hieroglyphs appear almost fully formed, as if invented in a single act of genius. Some scholars wonder whether they were inspired by Sumerian cuneiform, but whatever their origin, the Egyptians quickly made the script their own. It became the language of kings, priests, and scribes, a tool of power as much as of record. Alongside writing emerged the institution of kingship itself, transformed into something far greater than mere rule. The king was not only a man, he was a god on earth. He embodied Horus, the falcon soaring above the land, the son of Ra, the sun god whose daily journey across the sky mirrored the eternal cycle of life and death. One hymn declared, "Pharaoh is the bull of the sky, whose might is in the horizon. He lives on the being of every god, his glory is in the heavens." The word Pharaoh, familiar to us today, originally came from Pera, meaning great house. At first, it referred to the royal palace, not the king himself. Only later did it become synonymous with the ruler. But in every age, the reality was the same. The king was not merely a sovereign, but the axis of the world.